You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Hey, good Monday, everybody. Welcome back to the Unscripted Ohio Podcast. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. We are here representing BuckeyeGrove.com. It is good to be with you again today. So I got to issue a little mea culpa here, a little qualifier before we get rolling with the show. I want you to understand something. I've got some basketball discussion that I really enjoyed. First, I've got Galen Clavio. He is the host of Crimson Cast on thehoosier.com. They are the Indiana affiliate of the Rivals Network. We're going to get into some Big Ten discussion with him. And I also have Rocco Miller, the owner, operator, and proprietor of bracketeer.org. That is bracketeer.org. We're going to get into some bracketology discussion, discussing Ohio State, the Big Ten, number one seeds, and a few other things. I was really, really happy with both discussions. And, you know, sometimes doing this, the downfall, the pitfalls of recording a podcast ahead of time before you publish it and not doing it live or not doing it the same day, you know, you get into situations, you tend to outsmart yourself. You know, you try to project what's going to happen. You try to, thoroughly plan for all scenarios. And sometimes you take things for granted. And I admit in this case, I did these segments and I recorded them Wednesday. Normally I record my Friday podcast Thursday evening or Thursday afternoon, depending on the availability of somebody. But in this case, I decided to do it because I didn't want to record these segments and I didn't have time to record the segments after the Ohio State-Illinois basketball game. So I'm like, you know what? I'll try to do something that's not terribly time sensitive and, you know, I'll record them Wednesday and I'm going to make the assumption that even though it's not a done deal, it's not a guarantee, I'm going to make the assumption that Ohio State is going to beat Illinois in basketball at home. And look, it's not at all a slight on Illinois or assuming Ohio State is better than what they are, because Illinois came into the game winning 3 in a row. They're 5-8 in the Big Ten. Despite that ugly-looking 8-15 record, they've been playing a lot better basketball recently, but I figured, you know what, it'll all be fine, right? It'll all work out. So I recorded these segments with Galen and Rocco on Wednesday for the basketball discussion, and lo and behold, what happens? Ohio State loses at home to Illinois. So when you listen to the rest of the show, understand that these things are always fluid. They're always changing. And so, yeah, now Ohio State has this Illinois home loss on its record. I don't think it drastically changes the conversations we had any. You know, the Big Ten, we talk about the Big Ten as a whole. It doesn't really change that conversation. And it doesn't really, despite the bracketology dent, and this home loss to Illinois definitely makes a dent on Ohio State's profile. Despite that, though, I don't think it drastically changes their outlook right now for whether they would be in the NCAA tournament and what kind of seed that they would get. So, you know, that's an oopsie-daisy on my part. That's my bad. I outsmarted myself, but just take that into consideration when you listen to these, listen to these conversations here later in the show with Galen and Rocco. I hope you'll appreciate them and try to understand why we were basically more or less assuming or excluding a possible loss to Illinois. But that's what happens. So sometimes you record these things ahead of time and you get burnt, and that's what happened in this particular case. I also want to talk about here in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about why the FPI, which is the Football Power Index, it is run by ESPN. I'll explain why they made a gigantic mistake with their projection for the 2019 season. So I'll talk about that in a second. But let's go back to this game with Ohio State. You know, as I said, you know, Illinois is not a bad team, and I'm not trying to to dust up this loss and make it seem rosy, because it's the game that Ohio State still needs to win. They were, I think, 7 or 8 point favorites at home. They need to win these games. You've got to be, if you're going to be a tournament team, if you're going to finish strong down the stretch and make the tournament, especially with some landmine road games coming up, Michigan State, Purdue, Maryland come to mind. Especially with those games, you've got to win this game. I don't care how well Illinois is playing lately. It's still a team that has not been great all year. Now, they did give Gonzaga a run for their money early in the year. They played a tough schedule. They had won 3 in a row coming in. This is not a bad team by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a young team. It's an erratic team. It's a team that Ohio State still needs to be better than when playing at home. And they did not do that on Thursday night. And I think the frustrating thing, if you're an Ohio State fan watching this Ohio State team, is they're just so out of sync and out of rhythm offensively. The defense, I thought, was pretty good against a good, a pretty solid offensive Illinois team. But I didn't think even defensively they came up with enough stops when it really mattered. Now, there were a couple situations where Illinois threw up some threes after a really good defensive possession, and they threw up prayers with like 3 or 4 seconds left, and they kept nailing them. I got to give Illinois a lot of credit for that. And that big guy, I don't know about you, but I was frustrated with how he was officiated. He had so many chicken wings and push-offs, and he was getting the benefit of every call on both sides, offensively and defensively. I didn't think the officiating really was that lopsided from Illinois to Ohio State as a whole, but the way he was officiated versus maybe how Caleb continues to be officiated was kind of a frustrating aspect of this game, because he basically single-handedly fouled out Kyle Young, and Caleb was just not getting the same type of treatment from the officials that this guy was getting. But he's going to be a really good player. He's a freshman. Keep that in mind. He and their forward for him, the 4-star forward that made a couple of those shots. He's been averaging like 17 points over the last 12 games. Those two are both freshmen, so they've got a couple of really impressive young players. They're going to be very, very tough in the next couple of years in the Big Ten. But I didn't think that Ohio State came up with enough big-time defensive stops when they really needed them in the second half. And that combined with the fact that they just couldn't get anything offensively going, it was a really troublesome game for Ohio State. I thought this was, offensively, of all the games that they've had in this stretch going back to the start of the year, I actually thought this was the most troublesome offensive performance, because Illinois does create a lot of turnovers on defense. And that's something that we knew that they could exploit against Ohio State. We knew that would be a problem for Ohio State. But by the same token, generally Illinois has still given up some points, because if they're not turning you over, they're very vulnerable to back cuts. They're very vulnerable to scoring by getting penetration and getting a second and third pass against the interior of the defense. And Ohio State was just not able to do that with any regularity or inconsistency. And it really goes back, I think, to 2 things. Well, 3 things in this game. I mean, first and foremost, they just were not able to get Caleb any post touches. And some of that was the length and size of their forwards. They really did a good job denying passes, and Ohio State was just not able to get the ball inside. Number 2, of course, the lack of a point guard. And I think 2 and 3 really kind of coincide. It's the lack of a point guard, and also the lack of any real ball handling and comfort level handling the ball on the wing. Just Ohio State lacks guys. You can get away with having a true point guard as long as you have a team full of ball handlers or guys that make the right passes, and they just don't have that right now. And this really came to roost against Illinois in this game. And again, it's lazy passes. It's, not reading the passing lanes, not looking, assuming your guy is in the right place and then making a pass on that assumption and not looking. And they had so many of those live ball turnovers once again. And they dug themselves a little bit of a hole in the first half. They dug themselves another hole in the second half. It wasn't a huge hole. It wasn't, something that they couldn't overcome. but it was just enough when you're not executing your offense consistently, you can't dig yourself 7 to 9 point holes. You just can't, especially when you're scoring in the 50s, okay? So you can't come back from that as easily in a lower scoring, lower possession game. And that's really what happened here. So Ohio State now is in a position where, look, this loss doesn't kill them. I think, they're still in the tournament as of right now. Easily, if it were to begin today, they would make the field of 68. That's not an issue. But they have some really tough road games coming up now in the next couple weeks. And so their margin for error just shrunk considerably because of this. So now that I think they're in a position where they either have to win all 3 of their home games plus the Northwestern road game, or maybe they have to come up with one of those road wins at Maryland, at Purdue, at Michigan State. That's where I think they're sitting right now. But I'll talk to Rocco, of course, coming up later in the show, and we'll get his opinion because he's a West Coast guy. He's not a Big Ten guy. He's not an Ohio State guy. He's a West Coast guy. So he has his own opinion from the bracketology standpoint. And so we can ask him what he thinks of the Buckeyes. And again, this is kind of contingent upon before the Illinois result. So take that in mind. But we will ask Rocco about the Buckeyes coming up later in the show. So I want to switch gears here real quick before we get into some more Big Ten basketball discussion. ESPN released their college football college football FPI projections for the 2019 season, okay? And I should tell you right away, it's a very bizarre series of projections that they have here. I'm gonna list them off, and I want you to tell me if you see anything wrong or hear anything wrong with this picture. Number 1 is Clemson. I think we can all agree that's a perfectly reasonable projection for 2019. Clemson, defending champs, they've got a true freshman quarterback that'll be a sophomore next year. They've got a couple of young offensive players that were freshmen and sophomores. No issues there with Clemson being number 1. Alabama number 2, no issues there. Georgia number 3, no issues there. Now here's where things get a little bit dicey. Number 4, LSU. LSU finished 17th in the 2018 FPI rankings. Number 5, Michigan. And I know there are so many directions I could go with this, and I would like to make fun of this, but I'm not going to because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Now, interestingly enough, I saw some Michigan fans, trying to rationalize this, why Michigan would be number 5. Now, they finished number 6 in FPI. They've got a decent amount of talent coming back. I actually think their offense could be much improved this year. Their defense will probably take a step back. I don't see them as the number 5 pick. I don't see them as the number 5 team in the country in 2019, but I actually don't think this is ridiculous necessarily, but I saw one Michigan fan in particular say, well, this is a team that has 15 starters back that won 10 games this year. Okay. All right. Now put that in your memory, right? Put that in, bank that thought. Let's come back to that here in a second. Number 6, Oklahoma. Okay. Probably a little high. Kyler Murray's not going to be the quarterback. Jalen Hurts is taking over. I don't think they're going to have the same dynamic offense this year. I think they're going to take a big step back, but you know what? Maybe their defense improves. So, okay, number 6 doesn't seem that crazy. Number 7, Notre Dame. I can live with that. Number 8, Florida. Number 9, Auburn. And then number 10, Oregon. Oregon, by the way, finished 31st in the 2018 FPI at the end of the season. But you notice a huge omission, right? Glaring omission. Where's Ohio State? And this is crazy to me because, look, FPI, no matter what you think of FPI, their preseason projections in this case are going to take into account not only they're going to take the previous year's FPI, they're going to take into account who's returning, production coming back. And they also take into account recruiting. They look at the recruiting classes and they try to regress what your ranking should be based in part not only of your previous year's FPI and your previous, all the talent you have coming back, but they look at recruiting and how that talent typically develops in subsequent years. So from that standpoint, I have no problem with the methodology in general. But given Ohio State finished in the top 5 in FPI this past year, they were actually 4th. Given Ohio State finished 4th in FPI, and the fact that they have Justin Fields taking over for Dwayne Haskins, so you can maybe assume a really tiny drop-off, but not a huge drop-off at quarterback. But the thing is, Michigan, I mentioned how the Michigan fan said, well, Michigan has 15 starters returning from a team that won 10 games. Well, guess what? Ohio State has 14 starters returning from a team that won 13 games and has had basically the number 1 recruiting class in the Big Ten and a top 5 recruiting class for several years, up until this year. Now, they did drop a little bit because of numbers. Now, remember, per star ranking, this year's Ohio State class was, again, top 5. But because of total numbers, it was actually not a top 10 class. But when you take into account recruiting on top of what Ohio State has coming back with all that talent, 14 starters from a 13-win team, and yeah, they lose a record-setting quarterback, but they're also gaining a 5-star transfer that has the chance to be as good as any quarterback in the country. He's already got the 4th best Heisman odds for any player in the country. So clearly Vegas thinks he's going to be very productive. So I have issues with this FPI projection. I am not dead set against the FPI. I actually love FPI. You know my thoughts on statistical analysis and analytics. I think the analytics are solid in general. Maybe there are, better systems than the FPI, but this is not so much an issue with the FPI as much as this is just a really bad projection. Do I think Ohio State in any form should be ranked outside the top 10 for 2019? Absolutely not. I mean, on paper, they should be regarded as a top 5 team, and I don't want anybody coming away from this and having, confirmation bias that because Ohio State is not ranked in the top 10 here, that therefore it's a lousy system. But this is a lousy projection, and if I'm the makers of FPI right now, I'm a little embarrassed at this because how you can yield something that does not have Ohio State in your top 10, I think that is a problem. So anyhow, that is it's perplexing. It's just an algorithm. I don't expect them to make changes just because it produces something funky, but it is an issue, and it's a bad look for the FPI. So anyhow, let's get back to some Big Ten basketball, shall we? Galen Clavio, he is the host of the Crimson Cast, which is on thehoosier.com. It is an Indiana affiliate of the Rivals Network. Of course, if you've heard my podcast in the past, you know he's been on my program before. Galen, it's good for you to be back, my man.
Good to be back. It feels like we don't do this nearly enough.
We don't do it nearly enough. I almost thought about calling you last week to do a preview of the Indiana-Ohio State game, and then I thought to myself, why put any of us through that kind of torture?
Man, it's been. I know for Ohio State fans, last year you had a really, I guess, unexpectedly great season. IU fans did not. This year, I think IU fans expected to have a really good season, and it has definitely not been that. And it's been somewhat disappointing for Ohio State, too, I guess, at least comparatively to how things started out the year. But, yeah, the less said about that game before or afterwards, the better.
It's funny with Ohio State because if you go back, it's like you say, if you go back before the season and you look at the expectations for, Ohio State was picked anywhere from 8th to 12th in the league. Where Ohio State fans were at the beginning of the season, if you look at where they're at now, I think most Ohio State fans would be like, yeah, pleasantly surprised at where they're at. But because they started off November and December so well, that little, 5-game losing streak they had there in the middle has kind of soured things just a little bit. But relatively speaking, it's not the kind of disappointment that Indiana fans are feeling right about now. I'm guessing.
No, you're not guessing. You're absolutely correct. No, it's really been rough. I think IU fans similarly, people forget, this is a team that started the season 12-2. They were 3-0 in the Big Ten. They had beaten Marquette handily. I think most people outside the program, all they saw was the Duke blowout, and they assumed that was how the rest of the non-conference went. But no, it was a good non-conference. Things looked like they were headed in the right direction. And to lose 7 in a row and lose 10 of your last 11 games is just something that almost no IU fans have been able to come to grips with.
How are they taking, in terms of expectations and, how they feel about Archie Miller? How are they viewing this season, this disappointment? Is it, because I know you and I have talked so many times, Indiana fans were willing to give Tom Crean a pass for 5 years because of the whole Bear cupboard and everything. Is Archie Miller getting that same kind of pass? Is it more critical? How are they taking that?
Well, I'm always hesitant to answer this question definitively because I have to constantly remind myself that Twitter is not real life and that message boards are not real life either. But if message boards and Twitter were real life, I would tell you that Archie Miller is not getting a pass on this. Like, Archie Miller's name has been dragged through the mud quite a bit here over the course of especially this last month and a half. People are really angry. And I think that some of that is unfair because, it's been a combination of a lot of bad things that have cropped up. There's been a lot of injury issues and, not so much at the top end. Certainly Juwan Morgan's been healthy. Romeo Langford's been healthy, but, they lost their starting point guard to a concussion and he was out for quite a bit of time. They lost their backup point guard to an injury. He was out for a couple of weeks. The second ranked player in the recruiting class, Jerome Hunter, has missed the entire season due to injury. One of their primary post depth players, Race Thompson, has missed the entire season due to injury. A projected starter in Zach McRoberts has missed large sections of the season to injury or at the very least to very limited and physically painful play. So there's been a lot of those sorts of mitigating circumstances, but that really hasn't satisfied anybody in the IU fan base. I'd say the reaction has kind of on the mild side of things. It's been, well, the team needs to be playing better, and we understand these things are happening, but we don't understand why they start every game and they're down 10-0 right out of the gates, which does seem to happen with annoying frequency. And then there's people who are just convinced that Archie Miller can't coach, that he was a terrible hire, that he has no clue what he's doing, and that he's out of his depth. And I do see, a significant section of the online fan base, spurred on by a certain sports radio talk show host, they decided that that's the real problem, is that it's Archie Miller.
Well, and you may have seen this on Twitter, but I kind of lost it on Sunday because I saw somebody basically giving the whole Bear cupboard excuse for Archie. And look, I think you mentioned a lot of very real concerns that should mitigate some of the problems here for Indiana. The injuries, the suspensions, the tough league that we're going to talk about here in a second. There are so many things that I think go into this that are not Archie's fault. But a Bear cupboard is not one of them. You may say it's Bear because of the injuries and suspensions and everything. But I think when you have a Romeo Langford and a Juwan Morgan, who is a reigning All Big Ten player and a senior and one of the best post players in the league, I don't think it's a Bear cupboard per se.
Well, I think the issue is when people talk Bear cupboard, it's not the top end players. It's that there's very little experience depth anywhere on the roster, and I do think that that's a problem.
Yeah.
Juwan Morgan's class, he's the only player in the class. There's only one senior. There's only 2 juniors left in this class. Devontae Green, who has been injured and then also suspended, and is also not the most reliable player on the court. And then Deron Davis, who missed half of last year and most of this year with injuries. That's your entire junior class. Your sophomore class consists of only 2 guys that can get on the floor in Justin Smith and Al Durham. That's it. Everybody else is a freshman. it is of the scholarship players on this team, you've only got basically three guys in the sophomore, junior, and senior classes who are able to get playing time. That is a pretty bare cupboard, even when you take into account Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan. And so I think that's what people are talking about.
Well, Galen, Indiana has lost, 8 of 9 now. But here's the good news for the optimists out there. All they have to do now is go to Minnesota, then come home to Purdue, go to Iowa, come home to Wisconsin and Michigan State in back-to-back. That's all. That's the good news, right?
It's funny. I just recorded a podcast and somebody asked me, so what does a good ending to IU season look like? And I was like, well, a winning record, I guess. It's really bad. I mean, it's a tough conference, and even the easy games theoretically that IU's got the last two of the year, it's at Illinois, who has a pulse right now, and Rutgers at home. And Rutgers, they've won 5 games, I think, now in the Big Ten after beating Northwestern tonight. They're kind of on fire.
Yeah, they are. It's an incredible league. I mean, we've seen years where I think the top of the league is maybe a little better than this year. Back, I think 5, 6, 7 years ago, the top of the league was better. Back in the early 90s, you and I, we've talked about this, the golden age of the Big Ten, back in when you had Bobby Knight, Indiana, you had Big Dog at Purdue, you had the Fab Five, you had Ohio State teams in the early 90s were really good. That Big Ten, I think, was my favorite era as far as at the top. So we've seen, I think, a Big Ten be better up there, but from top to bottom, by far, this is the best I've ever seen it. I mean, even Penn State, who is now, won just 2 games and lost 11 in the league, I think 9 or 10 of those have been by single digits. So there is no such thing as an off night in this league this year.
Yeah, it's a really, really challenging league. I mean, when you look at the talent at the top end of the league, you have to say to yourself, well, okay, maybe nobody is Duke, but there's a lot of really talented teams. There's a lot of teams that play well collectively. And then even at the bottom of the conference, it's just the meat grinder. And those teams are beating up on each other constantly. And as we've seen, you could lose or get a scare regardless of whether you're playing on the road or at home. I mean, Northwestern should have won at Iowa the other night. It was kind of unfair to them that they didn't. We've seen other teams come really close in road games and home games. It's fascinating watching this league unfold so far, because while, certainly Indiana has underwhelmed and Nebraska has underwhelmed versus where they were earlier on in the season, you've seen Illinois get well. You've seen Rutgers get well. You've seen Minnesota kind of rise out of the ashes of their season and make something of it. It's been a really interesting year to see.
That's why I'm hesitant to be too critical of an Indiana or Nebraska or Ohio State, because some of these stretches we've seen, I think, are just being blown out of proportion because of the league. I think in years past, Nebraska or Indiana would have been able to stop these skids a little sooner if you had the typical get well games at the bottom of the league. But you don't have those this year. You can't take a night off and expect to live to tell about it. And so what in the past may have been a 3 or 4 game losing streak have become 5, 6, 7, 8 game losing streaks. And I think that's to be taken into consideration when looking at why Nebraska or Indiana are struggling so much.
I think that's part of it. I also just think that neither team is that good. Nebraska should be better than this. I think there's a legitimate excuse for IU between injuries and a lack of upper class leadership. That I can understand how they would go into a tailspin, or as I've been terming it, a death spiral. Young players tend to really struggle in those situations. There's really no excuse for Nebraska. I mean, James Palmer's a senior. Isaac Copeland's a senior. Glenn Watson's a senior. Isaiah Roby's a junior. There's experienced players on that Nebraska team. I don't understand what's wrong with them. And it's not even like they've been terribly competitive in the games that they've lost. So I somewhat agree with you. And I do think that the league is able to chew up certain teams that aren't built properly for it. But there's no reason why Illinois, of all teams, should have 5 wins in conference and Nebraska should have 3 at this point.
Is there any explanation for what's going on over there, northwest of Bloomington, with this Purdue team that looked, okay, not even looked, they are a one-man band, but somehow, they went from 6-5, granted it was a tough schedule, but they went from this 6-5 team that looked like they were destined for the NIT to all of a sudden, tearing through the Big Ten, and now, they're in a tie for the lead, and their roster outside of, their a couple starters really isn't that great, but somehow they're making that work. What's your take on this Purdue team?
Well, I think I come at them from opposite directions a little bit. On the one hand, I think, they were 6-5 at one point, but they really only had one loss I consider bad, and it was that Notre Dame loss in Bankers Life Fieldhouse. There are other losses, getting blown out at Michigan. That's not really a crime. Maybe it is in your neck of the woods, but most teams it's not. They lost to Virginia Tech on a neutral floor. They lost to a good Florida State team on the road. They lost to a pretty good Texas team. And, you look at those results and it's like, well, those are just better teams. And what they've done in the Big Ten, frankly, is they've won a bunch of games against teams that are either at their level or below. They have really gotten lucky, I think, as far as their schedule. Yes, they have beaten, Michigan State at home, and they deserve credit for that. But a lot of their other games have been against kind of mid-pack teams in the conference. Even their road wins. Wisconsin's been a little bit wishy-washy, and you want to talk about a one-man band. Like, let me point at Madison. They won at Ohio State when Ohio State was struggling, and the rest of their wins have been, Penn State, Rutgers, Minnesota, Nebraska. It's been, I don't think, as impressive as the record would indicate. And I think you saw some of that in that game that they lost at Maryland the other night. I mean, that was a team they barely beat at home, and they got annihilated in the last 7 minutes of that game. And it's going to be interesting moving forward because, frankly, the schedule, you could argue, gets easier for Purdue down the stretch. They've got their road games down the stretch are Indiana, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Northwestern. Not exactly a murderer's row of teams. So I think that's it. I think that they're riding an otherworldly performance offensively by Carson Edwards. They're getting good, solid team play out of their role players, and they're a prime candidate to lose in the first round of the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. It's just I don't like teams that depend on one or two players or depend on hot shooting because they're so vulnerable come tournament time to an early exit. You get one night, Carson Edwards goes, 4 of 16 and they're done. I mean, that's granted, they did beat Michigan State with him basically doing a 4 of 16, but in the NCAA tournament, that rarely works out.
Well, and I think Carson Edwards deserves a lot of credit, but he's also a volume shooter. I mean, he has put up, 460 shots this year, and his effective field goal percentage is 50.3%. Like that should tell you something.
Yeah, I agree. Who do you like in this race, coming down the stretch? Michigan State without Langford, Michigan finally showing an offense that has been really vulnerable of late. And you've probably seen, I've been preaching this for a couple of weeks now. The Michigan offense has always been a concern. Who do you like in that race? There's 4 or 5 teams that are in there right now.
At this point, I think Michigan State is going to edge out Michigan and Purdue. I could see Purdue, just by virtue of not having to play either Michigan or Michigan State, getting in there on that. But they're already a game back of Michigan State. If State and UM split their games, I think Purdue's going to lose at least one other. And I look down the road at what Michigan State's got. I mean, they got Ohio State, Rutgers at home. They got to travel to Indiana. They get Nebraska at home. That seems like a doable thing, and I think Michigan State's got their head back on their shoulders. I think it's going to be tight, though. I really could see any of those teams not so much winning it themselves, but maybe just being able to capitalize on one of the other two failing down the stretch a little bit.
You saw this Iowa team last week, and of course they followed up that win at Indiana with the the wild Northwestern comeback. What do you make of that team? I mean, this was a team that was on the verge of what looked like could wind up being a collapse, like late December, early January, and they've really seemingly righted the ship, and they're playing much better defense now too, which is what's impressed me.
Iowa's kind of like a junior version of Purdue in that they've lost pretty much every game, with the one exception of the home game versus Michigan, to teams better than them. Because you look down up and down their schedule, their losses are Wisconsin, Michigan State twice, and Purdue on the road, and then they've lost that weird game at Minnesota. It's kind of a typical Fran McCaffrey team. They're a great offensive team. When their shooting is going from outside, they can score with anybody in the country. I just watched it from the second row of Assembly Hall the other day. The shooting that Jordan Bohannon's been able to put together, the way that Joe Wieskamp and Isaiah Moss have been able to shoot from outside, it's really impressive. I just don't know how sustainable it is long term. They're a team that when they don't shoot the ball well, or when they run into a team that can score basket for basket with them, I think is vulnerable. There aren't that many teams in the conference that fit that bill, but I would say, you look at a Michigan State or you look at a Purdue, and they certainly fit that bill. And so, look, I think this is a season that Fran McCaffrey absolutely needed, with as many disappointments as he's had. And I think it's going to be a really fascinating team to watch next year, because they basically lose nobody of note. I mean, everybody, with the exception of Nicholas Baer, is going to be back. This could be the favorite for the Big Ten to start the 19-20 season. But as for this season, I think they're just going to be a fun team that's going to put up a lot of points in tournament play.
So I've got a two-part question for you. I mean, the Big Ten with the line, this is something I actually talked to Rocco Miller about coming up later. He and I got into some bracketology talk, but I'm going to ask you this question. So there's a pretty good chance we know, I think, eight for sure from the Big Ten, barring maybe a collapse by Ohio State or Minnesota. I think those top 8 seem to be pretty solidly in. Does the Big Ten find a ninth, maybe whether Nebraska somehow finds a pulse at the end of the year or Indiana gets back into it? Does the Big Ten get a ninth out of one of those two teams?
I don't think so. I think Nebraska's done as we record this, and it's always dangerous to mention this while going on, but they're already getting boat raced by Minnesota, and they're just running out of games. I don't see them pulling it together. They've already lost 10 games.
Yeah, it's amazing.
If they lose this game, they're going to be at best 9-11, and they don't have the non-conference resume to recover from that. Indiana still has a chance. If Indiana can get to 8-12 with wins over, I don't know, say Purdue, or Michigan State and Wisconsin, with what else they've got on their resume, and given how weak the bottom of the bubble is at this point, an 8-12 Indiana that's not an unreasonable mark to look at if they win a game or two in the Big Ten tournament. I'm not expecting that to happen, though. I do think that at the end of the day, Ohio State and Minnesota are both going to find their way in. Minnesota's schedule isn't that tough down the stretch, and really they just kind of need to tread water. If they can get to 9-11 or 10-10 in conference, they'll be fine. And Ohio State looks like they've righted the ship. I mean, you won 3 games in a row. Good wins already on the resume, and certainly could use some better ones. But there's opportunities to do that. Whether it's you have the home games against Iowa and Wisconsin, road games versus Michigan State and Purdue. There's opportunities there, I think.
Well, and the good thing for Ohio State also, in addition to all those road wins, is they don't have a bad loss. It looked there for a while, like when they lost to Rutgers, we all said what? I mean, but as it turns out, that's not a bad loss, so that really helps out. As long as they can, honestly, actually, as long as they beat Illinois at home and beat Northwestern at home, those are really the only games that could turn out to be bad losses for them. So if they take care of business at home, I think the rest of the way, yeah, they'll be in easily. So Indiana is interesting because, like you pointed to earlier, I mean, they've got those non-conference wins, against Louisville and Marquette, which really help, and then the game at Michigan State, and then a Butler neutral court win thrown in there as well. So Indiana has the wins. They just have to avoid the losses, which is going to be difficult because of that upcoming 5-game stretch. So they've got to at least just, hold water and at least win 1 or 2 of those to have any chance, I think.
Yeah, I mean, as I said on the podcast, they need to win 3 out of 4 at home, and those, their home games are tough, as we mentioned: Purdue, Michigan State, Wisconsin, and Rutgers. And then they need to pull out at least 1 road win, and that combination there gets you to 8 wins in conference, and probably puts you in, I don't know, the 8-9 or the 7-10 game in the Big Ten tournament. So there, you pick up a win there. As long as you lose honorably in that next round this year, that's probably enough to sneak in, maybe into the play-in game, maybe into one of the seeds immediately above that. That's about the only route, though, I think, for the Big Ten to get the number of teams you're talking about.
Well, this really shapes up for an interesting Big Ten tournament. I'm looking forward to it. And of course, Galen, that means that the tournament's going to be chalk, right? I mean, that's
always,
because every time we think it's a wide open tournament, it winds up, top 4 seeds make the semis. And
I'll tell you what I'm interested in. I'm really curious to see how this Maryland team plays in the Big Ten tournament, because that is a team that athletically is hard for almost everybody in the conference to match up with. And you look at the games that Maryland's lost over the course of the season, and other than that bizarrity that happened in Madison Square Garden, all of their losses have come on the road to the top half teams in the conference. And they've still got to go to Michigan, they've still got to go to Iowa. Even if they lose a couple of those games, I think they still have a good chance at being a 4 seed in the Big Ten. And I don't want to play Maryland on a neutral floor. I mean, having to go up against Bruno Fernando and Jalen Smith, having to deal with Eric Ayala's shooting from outside, or Aaron Wiggins, like that. That's a team with a lot of dangerous components to it that I think will be really interesting in tournament play. Yeah,
I tell you, Ohio State, I agree completely. Ohio State's 3rd loss in that 5-game stretch was to Maryland, and that was a game where Ohio State, actually played pretty well, but Maryland just hit everything. It's like it didn't matter. Ohio State was just doing everything they could to just tread water, and they were still down 4, 5, 6, 7. Despite playing well, and eventually Maryland, put it away at the end. But that team, when they're on, they're really scary.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of fascinating stories in the conference. I wish all of this was happening in a year where Zion Williamson wasn't playing for Duke, but we've had the cards we've been dealt at this point.
Yeah, Zion is definitely getting the lion's share of the publicity. So, all right, well, Galen, I appreciate you taking the time to talk some Big Ten. This was a lot of fun. You can catch Galen, as I said, on thehoosier.com. You can listen to the Crimson Cast virtually every week, give or take. And, of course, you can catch him on Twitter at Dr. GC. Galen, it was fun as always. We should do this again sometime.
Sounds like a plan. No better way to spend my Valentine's Day.
Stretch runtime here at Unscripted Ohio. Kick up your feet as we cross the finish line with the Buckeye Beat, the latest in Ohio State news and notes.
Kick the tires and light the fires, Big Daddy.
All right, we're here now with my guy, Rocco Miller. He operates bracketeer.org, been doing bracketology for several years. Rocco, how you doing, my man? It's a tongue twister there.
Hey, doing great, Kyle. I appreciate you having me on. How are things in Columbus today?
Oh, very, very unpredictable as usual. You never know what you're going to get with Ohio winters, and it's gone from like 0 degrees to 50 degrees to a snowstorm, back to 20 degrees to 50 degrees, and I haven't stepped outside yet today, so who knows what it is outside right now.
I don't know how you handle that. That's a tough place to live sometimes, I can imagine.
It is definitely, it has its challenges for the unpredictability factor. So I want to jump to Ohio State. Obviously, being an Ohio State centric podcast, I want to touch on them first. So a lot of people, I have asked, and I can give my opinions till they're blue in the face, but it's always better coming from somebody else, just because somebody with an outside point of view. So I want to ask you right now, as we sit and we're recording this before Ohio State plays the game against Illinois on Thursday, I'm going to assume for the time being that Ohio State wins that, but of course you just never know. And I hope for their sake that I haven't jinxed them. But excluding that game for right now, where do you have the Buckeyes sit as we record this on Wednesday?
Yeah, so as we record this on Wednesday, I've got Ohio State very safely in the tournament. I like to categorize the teams in the tournament by 5 different columns. So if you're on my website, especially on Mondays, I'll have that full breakdown. They would be in my fourth column, which is what I call in safely. So I don't think they're at too big of a risk yet to be out of the field, but they're also still, 3 tiers away from being at the top of the field. So I think they're safely in. I have them 27th overall on the seed list, which is a lower 7 seed. I can see the argument to have them more in the 8 or 9 range as well. It's really they're in this range today that is where they're being compared against the likes of a Buffalo, of a Washington, and those are teams that are really tough to compare with because the data is so much different. Ohio State, of course, has all these opportunities to play against tournament caliber competition, and they've done fairly decent. That win at Cincinnati has aged like fine wine. That is clearly the best win on the profile today, with Cincinnati sitting at 24th in the net. Those other 3 road wins, with those being Creighton, Indiana, and Nebraska, despite those teams maybe not being tournament teams at this moment, those are still quadrant 1 quality victories and really stand out against the rest of maybe the lower piece of the bubble. And so I've got Ohio State today as a 7 seed.
So, I think it's funny because there are a lot of people that maybe are holding their breath out there in Buckeye Nation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it's like Ohio State has kind of regained itself a little bit, winning 4 out of the last 5. But then there's always this concern that, because the Big Ten is so strong, that disastrous finish could be waiting ahead. And they do have obviously a tough schedule. And, they've still got road games at Purdue, at Michigan State, at Maryland, at Northwestern. So there are a lot of landmines ahead. Now, the good news, if Ohio State gets by Illinois this week, is there aren't really any opportunities for bad losses remaining in this league because there really isn't a bad loss to begin with, especially when you're on the road. So I guess my question is, what kind of scenario would it take for Ohio State to miss out on the tournament, given the shape of the bubble, which is something I want to ask you about here in a few minutes. But given that, that situation, what kind of scenario do you see playing out to where Ohio State would not make the tournament?
Yeah, so, with Ohio State today is 7-7 against the top 2 quadrants, and no bad losses outside of the top 2. So they do have the 4 home losses, and that's something to be aware of because if a team like Syracuse falls apart, that all of a sudden becomes a pretty ugly loss. But if they stay where they are today, it's certainly acceptable. And so looking at the final 8 games, 5 of those are against teams that are safely in the field, and they're big opportunities for the Buckeyes, especially the 3 on the road. Those being at Michigan State and Kyle, you probably have the rest of the schedule. But my point being is, I would say that they would have to be 2-6 down the stretch to really be at serious risk from what I can see today. Now, a lot of that question is answered by the teams around Ohio State and how the bubble shapes up as well. Because at current moment, the bubble is lacking a lot of signature wins, and those teams are going to have more and more opportunities. So as the next month goes by, you're going to see some bubble teams that we weren't taking as seriously as we are now really emerge and become a threat to a profile like Ohio State if they continue to lack a real signature win, that can supplement that Cincinnati win. But they'll get those opportunities again at Michigan State, at Maryland, and at Purdue. Those are big time opportunities. And then the home opportunities with Iowa and Wisconsin, I think they would want to at least split between those 2, ideally win them both. And then the landmine games, of course, would be Illinois coming up tomorrow night, and then Northwestern later on. I think that one's next Wednesday. So, Northwestern's net rating and so forth is staying high, so they can probably absorb a Northwestern road loss.
Yeah, and speaking of net, so we've got 2 interesting cases in the Big Ten. Nebraska, who last I saw, I didn't see the updated one, but they were 40 going into the new rankings this week. And Indiana was hovering around the top 50 as well. And it's amazing that both of those have stayed so high despite their free falls. These are interesting cases, especially Indiana. I think Nebraska right now is their hopes are fading pretty fast, but Indiana seems to have a legitimate shot still to get back in there despite 13-11 and losing 8 out of the last 9. Have you ever seen a case? I mean, I shouldn't say ever. I mean, there's been a few, but have you recently seen a case like Indiana is pronounced as this? I mean, they're going to have not a very good record, but because of the league situation and having a couple of great non-conference wins, they've got a chance to still sneak in somehow. It's really remarkable.
It is remarkable, and Indiana's got a really interesting piece to their profile right now. They've got 3 wins over the top 16. They've got a real big-time signature win at Michigan State, who arguably was a top 5 team now that Kentucky and Michigan fell last night. And so Indiana, they have to be careful, of course, because they're playing very poor brand of basketball of late. They're 6-11 against the top 2 quadrants, and again, you get to a certain point where you have a win percentage that's in the 300s against your top competition. At some point, it's going to be just too much to include you in the field, and I feel like compared to the rest of the field today, they should be on the outside looking in, because 3 of those 6 wins would be against teams outside of the field, including Northwestern and Penn State and Butler. And so, there's a huge drop off after those top 3 wins. And so if we're going to look at the whole body of work, which is what the committee does, you have to factor in, everything besides those top 3 wins. So you'll see some bracketologists out there today that are still including them in the field. But I do think it's just as important how many of these games and opportunities that they're losing. And so, I think they have, tons of more opportunities coming. I think this will play out and be a little bit more clear at the end. So out of the next 7 games, they get to go to Minnesota and Iowa on the road. They'll host Purdue. They'll host Michigan State. They'll host Wisconsin. And so I think if they could go 4-3, the other 2 are against teams outside. I think it's Illinois and Rutgers. If they can go 4-3 out of those last 7, that would make them an overall, and let's just say they win 1 game in the Big Ten tournament. That would put them at 18-14 overall, with a overall quadrant 1, quadrant 2 record of it would be, let's see, so 10-9. I'm sorry, take that back. So yeah, that would make them 9-14. So it'd be right on the edge, because last year's Oklahoma, to answer the second part of your question, they were on a free fall just like Indiana is today. They finished last year right at that same 18-14 mark. They finished 9-13 against the top 2 quads, and they still managed to get a 10th seed in the tournament. Now, they did have a little bit higher RPI ranking, which is what the committee used as a benchmark last year. One we're talking net, which has Indiana currently in the mid-40s. Last year, Oklahoma was mid-20s. So I think that would put them right on the some of the final conversations for the last couple spots. If that were to play out.
And I want to, since you've mentioned quadrant, I do want to explain real fast. People that have listened to the show before, you probably have heard me mention and talk about the quadrants. I do want to remind anybody that's listening, the quadrants basically, so all your wins and losses are split up into 4 quadrants, and basically the top quadrant is 1 through 50. Now that you may recall last year they changed that to where it's a sliding scale, so it's 1 to 50 on a neutral floor, 1 to I believe 35 at home, and 1 to 75 I think it is on the road. And so they're split up based on location into 4 quadrants, and essentially a quadrant 1 win is going to be a quality win. A quad 2 win is going to be decent, and anything below that's not going to matter a whole lot. And by the same token, any losses outside the first 2 quadrants are considered bad losses. So, Rocco's mentioned the quadrant system a few times, and so I wanted to clarify what that is. So Rocco, we talked about the bubble. What is it about the bubble this year? Because all bracketologists I've read this year. I used to be, knee deep in the bracketology myself, and last few years I haven't been doing it as much. But I've seen so many people reference this year. There's a huge, just a huge gap there at the end, right at the bubble, and there's a line of demarcation. What is it? What is that line this year, and what's causing it in your mind?
This is everyone's favorite topic. So, the gap is appearing to be a little bit more wide today because teams on the outside have not achieved enough yet on their profile. And I feel like there is this process that happens throughout the season. This year, it seems to be lasting longer than most years, and I think that's what's causing some of the angst amongst a majority of fans. But my thought overall is by the time we have another month of games played and majority of these, especially power conference teams, get the opportunity to get a lot more cracks at the signature wins, we're gonna start to see the teams separate further and create a little bit more distance. Right now, there's just a large cluster of teams, and it takes literally through the end of the year typically to be able to somehow separate those. And when still at the end, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with a solid 8 to 10 teams for those last 4 spots that you can make an argument for. But yeah, it does seem a little bit it's taking a little bit longer than usual this year. So I agree with you there. But I think the way it's going to play out eventually is the major conference teams, when they get their multiple chances, I think a conference like the Big East is a very interesting one because you've got 3 teams today, maybe even 4 if you want to throw Creighton in there with Butler, Georgetown, and Providence, that are a quality or signature win away from making it to the other side of the bubble, most likely, because they don't have a lot of bad on their profile. Their net ratings are solid. They have some good quadrant wins, but they need those elite level wins. But with linchpins like Villanova and Marquette in that league, for example, they'll get those opportunities at least once or twice more. So I'm looking for the Big East to have some control around the bubble, but there's obviously teams like Indiana and maybe Nebraska that can play themselves back in. And so it'll be very fascinating. I also want to call out, the Southern Conference, who has 4 quality teams this year. It's the best year in the history of the conference. Wofford today is safely in the field with a 28 net rating, with only 4 losses, all against teams safely in the field on the road. And that gives teams like Furman, who's already beat Villanova on the road, and UNC Greensboro, who only has 3 losses but could use a couple more wins. They still have chances to get those wins. And the Southern Conference could maybe hold a little nugget for a surprise team to get in if since Wofford's already safely in the field.
Last question I have for you before I let you go here, buddy. So as of today, who are your number 1 seeds, and what teams do you think have a legitimate shot at number 1 that you don't have on the 1 line right now?
Yeah, and I think we saw during the bracket reveal last week, if you guys all saw that, we had Duke as the number 1 overall, Tennessee number 2, Virginia 3, Gonzaga 4. My only change to that since Saturday would be Gonzaga and Virginia flip-flop due to the Virginia loss at home to Duke over the weekend. Gonzaga has been very impressive of late with their margin of victory and the dominance they've had, especially without Tilly. But I do think, Michigan State and Michigan are still in the running for a number 1 seed. I would say Kentucky slightly taking a home loss last night is really going to hurt. Michigan State probably in that next position for a 1 seed after a really quality road win at Wisconsin. I think that gives them a total of 9 quadrant 1 wins. So really if Virginia were to fall maybe one more time, or if Tennessee takes a bad loss, they could easily be justified as a 1 seed. So Michigan probably needs a little bit more to happen to get back up there, but that's what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, Michigan kind of killed it. Didn't kill their chances, but they took a big dagger with that loss at Penn State on Tuesday. That's for sure. So. Well, Rocco, again, everybody can check out Rocco's work on bracketeer.org, O-R-G. That is not a .com. If you go to a .com, you're not going to find basketball. So go to bracketeer.org. Rocco, I appreciate you coming on, my man, and it's always a pleasure talking basketball with you. That'll wrap it up for Unscripted Ohio for today. Thank you for giving me a listen. Of course, you can catch me anytime on Twitter at KYLam8. You can catch us every Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com. Of course, you can also catch Kevin Noon and Ross Bolton and Kirk Barton and Nevada Buck and the interns Cam and Andy and all the rest of us at Buckeye Grove any day at 24/7. Well, we're not all there 24/7, but you can catch us basically anytime on the message boards. Feel free to reach out and hit us up. If you want to listen to the podcast every Monday and Friday, you can also do so on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify. Be sure to come back on Monday. I'll be back with you for some more Ohio State football and basketball talk. And, of course, next Wednesday, you can catch the Scarlet and Great podcast with Johnny Lunsford and Corey Thompson. That'll wrap it up for today. Again, catch me on Twitter at KYLam8. We'll be back again on Monday. Hope you enjoy your weekend.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.